Over the past 4 weeks, we've been talking about what being the church is all about. Why do we exist? What do we hope to accomplish as the church in coming together? You know, the first week that we talked about our purpose, we talked about the great ends of the church. That very first week, we talked about the proclamation of the gospel for the salvation of humankind, which talks about the importance of telling others about God. The second week, we talked about the shelter, nurture, and spiritual fellowship of the children of God, which talks about creating a place where people can come and grow together in their relationship with God. The third week, we talked about the maintenance of divine worship with the understanding that worship is the devotion of time and talents and resources and life to something. In other words, we all are worshiping something. All of us are devoted to something. But as a church, we stress the importance of devoting life to God. Last week we talked about the preservation of the truth. And as a church, we are about speaking the truth about who God is and about who we are in relation to God. And that leads us to the fifth great end of the church. The fifth great end of the church is the promotion of social righteousness. I actually have to say that I'm glad that this is stated as one of the purposes of the church, because without it so plainly stated, our life with God might be all talk. Or as James puts it in his words, we might be merely hearers and not doers of the word. Too often I've heard people equate the church with a building, or perhaps they might even go so far as to equate it with the people who are dedicated to getting right with God. And that's great. I think it's important to have a close relationship with God. But if that's where it ends, then we miss something. We miss something important about being in the church. A very important part of the church. And there are a lot of passages that can confirm this. As you can see from our readings this morning, God is concerned about the hungry and the thirsty of the world. Goes so far as to say that the Lord will answer their call. The Lord will not forsake them. And in our reading from James, it says in the last verse that religion that is pure and undefiled before God. In fact, a better translation of that word religion is actually worship. That's what the word means. It doesn't mean religion, it means worship. And so with that understanding in place, a better reading of that verse might be, the worship that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for the orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Now, putting too much emphasis on the end of that verse that I just read to you, keeping oneself unstained by the world, it might make us think that worship is all about keeping ourselves safe and secure from the world, keeping the world at a distance and putting up a barrier so that it cannot in some way dirty us, stain us, make us unclean. And there are Christians that have sought to do this, to separate themselves from the world, to live an ascetic life like a hermit in a cave. But then there's the part of the verse that comes just before that, where it says to care for the orphans and the widows in their distress. And with that short part of the verse, our whole purpose is shifted from one that is simply personal to one that is based on compassion and concern for others. Just recently, I've been teaching the scouts that meet over at Standing White Presbyterian Church about God and their families. In fact, I spent a whole day yesterday in a class learning how better to teach the scouts. We've touched on in our class together, in our time together, on how important God is to our families. And one of the requirements of earning the God and Family Award, which is what we're working towards, is to memorize the Ten Commandments. Now, be honest here. How many of you here today can name every single one of the Ten Commandments right off the top of your head? That's okay. I've had to study it quite often in order to be able to do that. And I've actually had to motivate the kids in order to do this as well, giving them little goodies from time to time when they get it right. But I think it's an important thing that they're learning these Ten Commandments. I mention this because when it comes to who we are as the people of God, it's not just about our personal relationship with God. It's not just about that. That's important. But that's not even half of the Ten Commandments. Did you realize that? It's not even half of the Ten Commandments. 4 of the commandments have to do specifically with our relationship with God. No other God, no idols, no wrongful use of God's name, keeping the Sabbath day holy as a day set apart for rest and renewing your relationship with God. But then there are the other 6 commandments. These other 6 commandments have to do with our relationship to the world. Honoring our parents. Not committing murder or adultery or stealing or lying or coveting whatever it is that our neighbors have. Jesus once spoke about these commandments, and he ended up summarizing all of them into just 2 commandments. Love of God and love of others. And that's what the 5th great end of the church points towards. Not just the love of God, but the love of others. Social righteousness. That's how it says it in the words that it uses there. But that's what it really means, is the love of others. The part of our life of faith that deals with showing love. God's kind of love. God's kind of love to the world. Just last week, a few of the elders of our church went to watch a movie together. There's a movie about the decline of churches in America. In the movie, there were some depressing stories about churches that were closing. There were stories about churches that were in turmoil. There were stories about churches that really couldn't tell you why they were there, what their purpose was, what they hoped to accomplish. It was a sad movie. It was a sad movie, and I'd have to say that it's not one for faint of heart. But in reflecting on it, I'm glad that it actually raised the question of what is the purpose of the church? The people who filmed the movie actually made a great tie to the Kodak Company. I know a little bit about the Kodak Company because Wendy's family, a long time ago, actually donated property to the Kodak Company, hoping that they would preserve it and keep it as almost like a wildlife refuge. Well, many of you remember how Kodak used to be the leader in everything having to do with pictures. You didn't have to look very far in order to find Kodak film or Kodak cameras or a Kodak processing center. You know, they had those little Kodak photo booths that you could take your film to. I can remember growing up hearing the old slogan, "Make it a Kodak moment." Y'all remember that? Kodak was more than a household name. It actually stood for pictures and preserving memories all around the world. Did you know that just 2 years ago, Kodak filed for bankruptcy? Just 2 years ago. They went from being a giant in the industry of pictures to being almost forgotten. And why? It's not because they didn't make great film. It's not because they didn't make great cameras that operated on film. It's because they forgot their purpose. It wasn't to make film. It wasn't to make cameras that use film. It was about pictures and preserving memories. But with the rise of digital photography, they refused to accept that pictures could be done better than film, and so as more and more people turned to digital cameras and storage discs, Kodak faded into the background. In the movie that we watched together, the producers asked the question of, how is what is happening to the churches today anything like what happened to Kodak? Have we forgotten what our true purpose is? Are we so attached to something that we are forgetting what we're really all about? The film went on to raise the question of whether our purpose is to preserve a building, whether our purpose is to provide for Sunday school, whether our purpose is to make members, or if our purpose is something more than that. That all of these things were created to achieve. That all of these things were created to achieve. I believe that the great ends of the church remind us of what our true purpose is. Why we exist, why we come together. It's to enable us to proclaim the good news, to be nurtured in our faith and our understanding, to be equipped and empowered to better worship God, to learn and to grow in our relationship to Christ. And as was stated today, to promote social righteousness. As our call to worship this morning meant to remind us, what does the Lord require of us? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. In promoting social righteousness, we show not only our love of God, but our concern for all that God has created. And so we would seek to become actively involved in seeking justice and seeking ways to improve the lives of all people and meeting the needs of others, just as Jesus prompted us to do when he said so long ago in the Gospel according to Matthew, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." And we know how the story goes. For I was hungry, and I was thirsty, and I was a stranger, and I was naked, and I was sick, and I was in prison, and you came, and you took care of me. And the people were kind of confused, and they said, "When was it that we did all this for you, Jesus?" And Jesus said, "Just as you did it to one of the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it for me." Today is a day that we call World Communion Sunday. Other churches actually call it Unity in the Church Sunday, or Unity of Christians Sunday. This is a day when we remember that we are only a part. We are only a part of a much broader cloud of witnesses, spanning around the globe. As we come to the table today, I invite you to remember the importance of our relationship. Not only with God, but with the world into which God has sent each of us. To carry out God's will. And to express God's love and kindness and justice and faithfulness and mercy. May we do so. All of us together. This day and all the days to come.